Does the Bible guarantee a fetus equal protection under the law? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and if you've been around my channel for any length of time, you've seen me address this question many times by pointing to the only passage in all the Bible that directly addresses the question of the legal status of a fetus, and that passage is Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25. And this is part of the covenant code. This is very old legislation from Exodus that imposes two different penalties for two different outcomes should two men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And the first outcome is that the injury causes the woman to miscarry, in which case the penalty that is prescribed is a fine imposed by the husband and arbitrated so that it is not exorbitant. The other outcome that is addressed is the death of the woman, in which case the penalty that is prescribed is talionic justice, which is where whatever was done to the victim is done to the perpetrator. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for life. So in the case of the death of the woman, that means the death penalty for the perpetrator. And the scholarly consensus is that the vastly different severities of these two penalties indicates that a fetus was not considered a full legal and moral person. It's treated more like property. This is the scholarly consensus. You can look at early halakhic discussions. You can look at the SBL Study Bible. You can look at the Jewish Study Bible. You can look at commentaries. You can look at monographs. This is what most scholars agree is going on here. Now, last year, a medical doctor from the UK named Callum Miller, who also has a master's degree in biblical studies, published this paper in the journal Christian Bioethics, where they argue, among other things, that Exodus 21 does not make a case for abortion. And yesterday, Dr. Miller engaged a discussion I was having with some other folks on Twitter to call my argument dishonest and then to link to his paper. And I told Dr. Miller I would respond to his paper in a video. So let's get into the response. But the first thing I want to point out is that something that I have consistently and repeatedly maintained on social media in the videos I've made that have addressed this question is that the Bible does not necessarily condone or endorse or support abortion. I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument that the Bible conceptualizes a fetus as more property than person. A fetus is not given equal protection under the law according to the only part of the Bible that addresses the question. That's my argument. My argument is not that the Bible supports abortion. So I'm only going to address those parts of the paper that, one, address Exodus 21, and two, are addressing the interpretation of Exodus 21 as distinguishing the value of a fetus from the value of a full legal and moral person. So let's get into the argument. The first thing to say in response is that a smaller punishment does not necessarily mean that the victim is less valuable. While it's absolutely true that this is not necessarily the case, Dr. Miller does not go on to demonstrate that that's the case here in Exodus 21. Dr. Miller points to jurisprudence within early Christianity and within the modern world where there are differences of degrees in punishments for the same crime of homicide or murder. But in Exodus 21, what we have is not difference of degrees, but a difference of kind. The death penalty over and against a small fine that the husband of the victim gets to choose is a difference of kind, not degrees. So not only is early Christian and modern jurisprudence irrelevant because it has nothing to do with the juridical context of the composition of Exodus 21, but that is also about difference in degrees and not in kind. And again, my position is the academic consensus, which Dr. Miller has not addressed, has not adequately engaged. Now, Dr. Miller goes on to say that the difference here is obvious. The difference is because the miscarriage was entirely unintentional. And this is a bafflingly ignorant argument because the other punishment is the death penalty for the same accidental injury. And so to understand the first punishment to be so much less because it's accidental is to entirely ignore that the most severe possible punishment is also for the same accidental crime. This is just a nonsensical argument. Someone is not thinking very clearly when they make this argument. But let's move on. The next relevant part of this paper is going to argue that it is a misinterpretation to understand Exodus 21 to be referring to either miscarriage or the death of the woman. Miller's argument is going to be that it's probably a better reading to understand the two outcomes to refer to premature birth followed by no other injury to the baby, or the miscarriage of the baby, in which case the miscarriage results in the death penalty. Now, I've addressed this many times in the past, but I want to directly address the specific arguments made by Miller. First, he's going to argue that yatzah is more commonly used to describe live birth than the very rare translation of stillbirth. On statistical likelihood alone, it is likely that the passage refers to live birth. If all we had to go on was how frequently this verb is used in reference to either live birth or miscarriage, that would be true. But that's not all we have to go on. There's a lot more to this that I'm going to get to. But Miller goes on that there was a much more specific word used for miscarriage in Hebrew, shachal, which was known to the author or authors since it was used 2 chapters later to mean miscarry. The biggest problem here is that discussion 2 chapters later is actually not a part of the covenant code. That's a different narrative from a different time period and a different set of authors. And scholars have long acknowledged as well that the covenant code has a rather idiosyncratic use of legislative language. So that's not really a legitimate argument. But let's talk about the verb yatzah. It can be used to refer to both stillbirth, miscarriage, as well as normal birth. But an injury-induced preterm birth is not really a normal birth, and the language that usually goes with the use of yatzah in reference to normal birth is not used here. But it's not a real big mystery, because we know this is a reference to miscarriage because the covenant code is borrowing directly from the laws of Hammurabi. You can check out David Wright's excellent book, Inventing God's Law, for a comprehensive argument for this. But as you can see on this table, the laws of Exodus 21 and 22 follow the laws of Hammurabi, and in many cases in the order they appear in the laws of Hammurabi. And in Wright's book, he goes through why the authors of the covenant code are altering these laws the way they are. But they're borrowing this law directly from a similar law in the laws of Hammurabi that talks about the same two outcomes for injury to a pregnant woman, causing her miscarriage or causing her death. In fact, this kind of case law is found in several different ancient West Asian law codes. We see it in the Middle Assyrian laws. We see it in the laws of Ornamu and Eshnuna. We see it in a variety of different places. And in every single place, it's the exact same two outcomes: hitting a woman and causing her to miscarry or causing her death. There is never a law anywhere in ancient West Asia that addresses what to happen if a man hits a woman and causes her to give preterm birth or causes her to miscarry. That's not in any of those laws. Now, certainly it's not outside the realm of possibility that the covenant code is altering the law in that direction, but you have to make the case for that. And no adequate case has been made yet. So that argument falls to pieces. Now, after this, Miller's going to go on to argue that the word for children is yeled, which is a perfectly ordinary word for children, not embryo or unformed substance, as in Golem. The straightforward reading of the text, therefore, is simply her children are delivered, which has no connotation of miscarriage at all, and simply suggests a normal delivery in the absence of indicators otherwise. But we have indicators otherwise, including the fact that this is plural. It says her children come out. Why is it referring to plural children? In that footnote, Miller acknowledges that this is plural, but just says, we're not sure. There's not a widespread agreement on this. And while it's true that there have been a bunch of different attempts to figure out what's going on here, there is pretty general agreement that this refers to miscarriage, however we interpret it. You can look in the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. One of the senses for the noun form of yeled is miscarriage, and the passage that is cited there is Exodus 21. We can look in Juan and Moraoka's Grammar of Hebrew. They cite this passage in their discussion of the plural of generalization. Other people think that it refers to the plural materials of a pregnancy. Other people think it refers to an abstract plural, talking in the abstract about the pregnancy coming out. So there are a bunch of different takes. There is general agreement, however, that it definitely refers to a miscarriage. There's not a good case to make that the plural is supportive of reading this as just preterm birth. So in the end, there are two facets to Miller's argument. On the one hand, Miller argues that if the interpretation is correct, that the two outcomes are miscarriage or the death of the woman, the disparity in punishments is not necessarily indicative of the conceptualization of a fetus as more property than person, because we have early Christian and contemporary jurisprudence where there are different punishments for the same crime of homicide or murder. The problem, however, is that those are entirely irrelevant and unrelated juridical contexts, and also those are differences of degrees, not of kind. So the question hasn't really been directly addressed. I've also pointed out that the notion that the unintentional nature of the injury is the reason for the less severe punishment is bafflingly stupid in light of the fact that the death penalty is also imposed for that unintentional injury if it results in the death of the mother. So that facet of Miller's argument is entirely inadequate. The other facet of Miller's argument is actually arguing that that interpretation is incorrect and that we should instead understand the two outcomes to be premature birth followed by no harm to the child, or a miscarriage. And as I've pointed out, that's not engaging the scholarly consensus. That's not engaging the critical scholarly discourse that's going on right now about how we should be interpreting this. That's just using poor apologetic arguments that are incomplete and are ignoring the questions that scholars have long raised about the adequacy of those arguments. So that facet of Miller's argument is also woefully inadequate. So again, this is just a poor apologetic argument that is cherry-picking things that it's going to address and is counting on the naivete and the confirmation bias of the readership so that people will feel compelled to accept these laughable arguments that would not fly in a critical context. And the fit for this video has been, what up, party people?